The first thing I remember hearing was the microphone screaming. Not the crowd, not the music, not the glasses clinking in that expensive ballroom, just that sharp, ugly sound cutting through the room as a man named Victor Hale ripped the microphone from the podium and pointed it straight at me like he was aiming a weapon. Then he looked over at the security guards and said 3 words that changed the entire night. "Get him out." My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 62 years old that night, and I walked into the Hawthorne Grand Hotel wearing an old military jacket, carrying a canvas bag full of letters and photographs, thinking I was finally going to keep a promise I made 30 years earlier. I never imagined I would end up on the marble floor of a 5-star ballroom while 300 people watched me like I was some kind of problem that needed to be removed. The funny thing is, when you're young, you think people judge you by what you do. When you get older, you realize a lot of people judge you by what they can see in 5 seconds. They saw my worn boots. They saw my faded jacket. They saw a man who didn't look like he belonged among CEOs, politicians, and decorated officers. They never bothered to ask why I was there. Victor Hale was the chairman of the Hawthorne Veterans Foundation, a man who had built his reputation on making sure the right people stood on the right stages. He loved cameras, speeches, and shaking hands with wealthy donors, the kind of man who could turn a charity event into a personal campaign for himself. I had met people like Victor before, men who loved the idea of honoring heroes more than actually listening to them, but I still believed that night would be different. I was wrong. I had received a simple invitation 3 weeks earlier. No fancy envelope, no personal phone call, just a letter saying that my presence was requested at the annual Valor Recognition Ceremony. I almost threw it away. I honestly thought it was a mistake. I hadn't worn a uniform in decades. I wasn't looking for applause. I wasn't trying to get my name on a wall. I was just carrying something that belonged to someone else, something that had waited 30 years to come home. When I walked into that ballroom, I remember feeling uncomfortable immediately. The floor was polished so perfectly I could see my reflection in it, and honestly, I looked like I had accidentally walked into the wrong building. Everyone around me wore custom suits and expensive watches. I was wearing the same jacket I bought from an army surplus store years ago because it reminded me of where I came from. I stood near the entrance holding my invitation when Victor noticed me. At first, he just stared. Then, he walked over with that polite smile people use when they're already annoyed. "Can I help you?" he asked. I handed him my invitation. He looked at it, then looked at me. "This is a private event," I told him. "I know. That's why I brought the invitation." He smiled, but there was no kindness behind it. "Sir, this isn't a shelter or a public ceremony. This is for invited guests." I remember looking around and wondering if anyone else noticed what was happening. They did. They just chose not to say anything. That's the part people don't talk about. Cruelty doesn't always happen because one person is cruel. Sometimes it happens because everyone else decides staying quiet is easier. I calmly explained that I was on the list. Victor laughed under his breath and said, "I'm sure there has been some misunderstanding." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the invitation again. Before I could finish explaining, he grabbed it from my hand. He didn't even read it carefully. He just wanted to prove he had control. Then he walked toward one of the candles on the table and held the paper above the flame. I still remember the smell of burning paper. "There," he said. "Problem solved." The room went silent for a second. Then a few people laughed. Not loud laughter. Not the kind you hear in a comedy club. The uncomfortable kind. The kind people make when they want to show they're on the winning side. I could have argued. I could have shouted. I could have told everyone exactly who I was and what I had done. But I didn't. Because, the truth is, I wasn't there for me. I had spent 30 years carrying someone else's memory. I wasn't going to let a man like Victor turn that into a fight about my pride. I picked up my bag and started walking toward the exit. That's when the strap broke. The bag hit the floor, and everything I had protected for 3 decades spilled across that beautiful marble floor. Hundreds of folded letters, old photographs, memories that smelled like dust, smoke, and another lifetime. People stepped back as if those pieces of paper were dirty. But then one photograph slid across the floor and stopped near the center of the room. It was a picture of 3 young soldiers standing together, smiling before they went into a war they might never return from. I dropped to my knees to pick it up, and that's when someone said the words I still remember. "Look at him, crawling on the floor of a $500 ballroom." A phone came up, then another. Suddenly, there was a wall of screens pointed at me. A 62-year-old man on his knees, reaching under a table for a photograph of men who never got the chance to grow old. And while everyone was watching me fall, nobody realized they were about to discover exactly who they had just humiliated. Because hidden inside that old canvas bag was a story Victor Hale had no idea existed. And before the night was over, every person in that room would know the name Daniel Mercer. I wish I could say that moment on the floor was the worst part of the night, but it wasn't. The worst part was realizing that almost everyone in that room had already decided who I was before they knew anything about me. They didn't see a man who spent years carrying someone else's story. They saw an old jacket, worn boots, and a face that didn't match the room. And for a few seconds, I wondered if maybe I should just leave, pick up my bag, walk back outside, and let them keep believing whatever made them comfortable. But then I looked down at that photograph in my hand. 3 young men staring into a camera, laughing like they had no idea what the future would ask of them. One of those men never made it home, and I had promised him that his name would never disappear, so I stood up. Slowly, I picked up every letter, every photograph, every piece of my past scattered across that floor, and I put them back into the bag. Nobody helped me. Not at first. They just watched. But there was one person who did notice. Her name was Emily Carter, a 24-year-old catering assistant working the event. She had been carrying trays all night, mostly invisible to the people wearing tuxedos and expensive jewelry. The funny thing about people who are overlooked is that they often notice things everyone else misses. She saw the way Victor treated me. She saw the way people laughed. And she saw something in those photographs that made her stop. She walked over, picked up one of the letters that had fallen near her feet, and handed it back to me. "Sir," she said quietly, "I think this belongs to you." I nodded and thanked her. She looked around the room and then looked back at me. "Are you okay?" I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because nobody had asked me that all night. I told her, "I've been through worse." She smiled a little and said, "I figured you had." That was the first genuine human moment I had experienced in that room. Then Victor noticed. Of course he did. Men like Victor always notice when they lose control of a situation. He walked over, angry now, no longer pretending to be polite. "Emily, step away." She looked at him. Why? That one word bothered him more than an insult would have. Because people like Victor don't expect questions. They expect obedience. "Because I said so," he replied. Emily looked at his name tag, then at the crowd, then back at him. That isn't really an answer. The room became quiet again. Victor leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Do you know how easy it is for someone like you to lose a job?" Emily didn't move. She simply removed her catering badge from around her neck and placed it on the table beside his wineglass. "Then I guess you should keep it," she said, "because I don't think I want to wear it anymore." That was the first crack in Victor's perfect little world. He wasn't used to people standing up to him, especially people he believed were beneath him. He looked at me and shook his head. "You don't even understand what's happening here, do you?" he said. "This is a ceremony for heroes." I looked at him and said, "You're right." He smiled, thinking he had won. Then I continued, "That's why I'm here." His smile disappeared. I didn't come to argue with Victor Hale. I didn't come to prove I was important. I came because there was a name missing from that stage. A name that should have been spoken decades earlier. I walked past him toward the front of the ballroom. The conversation stopped. The music faded. 300 people watched as I approached the velvet display case sitting beneath the spotlight. Inside was the centerpiece of the evening, a military honor that was about to be presented during the ceremony. I could feel every eye on me. Some people were curious. Some were embarrassed. Some were still waiting for security to drag me away, but I kept walking. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the one thing I had carried with me everywhere for 30 years. My old dog tag. The metal was scratched. The chain was worn. It wasn't valuable to anyone else. But to me, it was heavier than gold. I lifted it over my head and placed it gently on top of the velvet case. The room went completely silent. Then I said, "I didn't come here for a medal." Nobody moved. "I came here to bring someone home." Victor laughed quietly from behind me. "This is ridiculous." But nobody laughed with him this time. I looked at the case and remembered a night 3 decades earlier. A night that still visited me when I closed my eyes. We were 20 miles outside a small village overseas. My unit had been caught in a situation none of us expected. We were young, scared, and trying to survive. The man in that photograph was Sergeant Elias Brooks. The kind of person who made everyone around him feel safer just by standing there. He wasn't the loudest guy in the group. He wasn't the one looking for attention. He was the one who checked on everyone else before himself. When things went wrong that night, Elias didn't run. He moved toward the danger. He helped 14 men get out. 14. I was one of them. I still remember grabbing his arm and telling him we had to go. I remember him looking back at me and saying, "Make sure they remember us." Those were the last words he ever said to me. For 30 years, I carried that sentence like a responsibility, because after the war, everyone remembered the battle. Everyone remembered the operation, but somehow one, Elias Brooks, became a footnote, a name buried in paperwork, a hero nobody talked about. I tried for years to fix it. Letters, phone calls, meetings. Most people told me the same thing. The paperwork is complicated. That's a phrase people use when they want you to stop asking questions. So I stopped asking, and I started carrying his story myself. That night at the ballroom, I opened the old canvas bag and pulled out a folder filled with letters. Every letter was proof. Every photograph was a piece of history. Every signature was someone who remembered what Elias did. Victor stared at me, confused now. The confidence was gone. He finally realized this wasn't some random old man trying to steal attention. This was something bigger. Then the doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Everyone turned. A man in a decorated military uniform walked in. It was General Marcus Whitmore, the guest of honor for the evening. The room instantly changed. People stood. Conversations stopped. Victor straightened his jacket. This was the moment he had been waiting for all night. The moment where he would stand beside a general and show everyone how important he was. But General Whitmore wasn't looking at Victor. He was looking at me. He walked slowly across the room, picked up the photograph sitting beside the display case, and stared at it for several seconds. His expression changed. Not confusion, not surprise, recognition. "Where did you get this?" he asked. I looked at him and said, "I was there." The general looked back at the photograph. His hands started shaking slightly. Then he opened the folder of letters. He read the first page, then the second. The entire ballroom watched as the man everyone had ignored became the only person anyone cared about. Finally, General Whitmore looked toward the display case and whispered something that made Victor's face turn pale. Because the name engraved beneath that medal wasn't just connected to a forgotten soldier, it was connected to me. And when the general stepped forward, holding that medal in his hands, everyone in that room realized they had spent the last 20 minutes humiliating the very man they were supposed to honor. General Whitmore stood there holding the medal, and for the first time that night, nobody knew what to say. The same people who had been whispering moments earlier were now completely silent. The phones that had been recording me on the floor were still raised, but nobody was laughing anymore. They weren't filming a humiliation anymore. They were watching a truth finally come out. The general looked at me and said, "Daniel Mercer, I spent 30 years wondering if I would ever meet the man who carried Elias Brooks' story this far." Hearing his name spoken in that room hit me harder than I expected, because for years, Elias had only existed in my memories, in old photographs, in letters nobody wanted to read. But now, 300 people were hearing his name, not as a forgotten soldier, not as a line in a report, as a person, a brother, a hero. General Whitmore turned toward the crowd and explained what happened decades earlier. He told them how Sergeant Elias Brooks saved 14 men during one of the most dangerous operations of that deployment. He told them how Daniel Mercer was one of those men. He told them how the official recognition had been delayed because of lost records, incomplete reports, and years of bureaucratic mistakes. But Daniel never stopped trying to make sure Elias received the honor he deserved. Then the general looked back at me and said something I will never forget. "You weren't forgotten because nobody remembered. You were forgotten because nobody listened." And that sentence stayed with me, because sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought on a battlefield. Sometimes they're fought in offices, in meetings, in rooms where people decide whose stories matter. General Whitmore lifted the medal and walked toward me. Every step felt like time moving backward. 30 years of waiting. 30 years of unanswered letters. 30 years of carrying someone else's name. Then he placed the medal in my hand. Not on a stage, not during the ceremony. Right there in the middle of the room where Victor Hale had tried to throw me out. "This was meant for you too," the general said quietly. I looked down at the medal, but I didn't feel like I had won anything. I didn't feel like I had defeated Victor. The truth was, I still wished Elias could have been there to receive it himself. That was the part people never understand about recognition. Sometimes it arrives too late to heal the person who deserved it most. Behind me, I heard Victor moving. The same man who had been so confident earlier was suddenly trying to disappear. He avoided eye contact. He walked toward the kitchen entrance instead of the main doors. Someone asked him where he was going, but he didn't answer. He simply left. And honestly, that was the most fitting ending for a man like Victor. No dramatic speech. No big confrontation. Just a quiet walk away from a room where everyone finally saw him clearly. Later that night, Emily found me outside the hotel. The rain had stopped, and the city lights reflected off the wet pavement. She handed me the old photograph that had fallen earlier. "I think you almost left without this," she said. I smiled and told her, "You know, 30 years ago I thought being brave meant running toward danger." She asked, "And now?" I looked back at the ballroom windows glowing above us and said, "Now I think sometimes being brave means staying long enough for the truth to catch up." That night changed a lot of people. Some people apologized. Some people avoided me. Some people who had laughed earlier suddenly wanted to tell me they supported veterans all along. Funny how quickly people change when they realize the person they judged has a story they can't ignore. But the person I think about most is still Elias Brooks. Because this was never really my story, I was just the person who refused to let his story disappear. Years later, people still ask me why I kept those letters for so long, why I carried that old bag everywhere, why I didn't give up when nobody seemed to care. And my answer is simple. Because promises don't expire just because time passes. Because a person's worth isn't measured by how expensive their clothes are, how many people know their name, or whether they walk into a room looking important. Sometimes the person everyone ignores is the person carrying the most important story in the room. So I want to ask you something. If you had been standing in that ballroom that night, watching an older man being judged before anyone knew his story, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Would you have looked away? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Because this isn't just about one veteran, one medal, or one night. It's about how we treat people when we think nobody important is watching. Share this story with someone who believes respect should be earned through character, not appearance. And remember, sometimes the quietest person in the room is carrying the loudest story.